Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Hello, hello, hello. Thank you all so much for joining us today for our Learning Institute. My name is Ariel Frost. I am the Manager of Partnerships and Learning here at Ingenuity. And we're very excited that you're all here. I'm also joined here by Gina Spears, who's facilitating our workshop today. A little bit about Gina. She's been teaching dance in Chicago Public Schools for over 25 years. In 2019, she started a dance program at Portage Park Elementary, a pre-K through 8th grade school. She's currently the Magnet Cluster Lead Teacher, leading arts integration learning for the staff of the school. And Gina leads professional development as an arts teacher leader for the CPS Department of Education, a framework specialist with the CPS Office of Teaching and Learning, and has recently been developing her own workshops for dance educators in a virtual, in-person, and asynchronous setting. We are so happy and excited to have Gina here today. Before we continue, Ingenuity would like to acknowledge that this convening is taking place on the stolen and unceded land of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa nations. Because of the Great Lakes, the land naturally became a site of travel, healing, trade, and gathering for more than a dozen other native tribes. And is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois that practice their traditions and care for the land. As we begin this program, we invite you to consider how to incorporate the study of Native people's arts and culture into your practice in solidarity and alignment with Illinois House Bill 1633, a new law that went into effect this school year, mandating Native histories be taught in K-12 schools in Illinois. You can find out more by scanning the QR code on the screen or by going to chicagoaicc.com. Just a few important notes. If you haven't already, we invite you to update your name with your pronouns and your organization's name, and you can do that by hovering over your image icon and selecting the 3 dots. Note that today's session will be recorded, and the recording will go up on our YouTube channel soon after this session. Additionally, handouts and slides will be available following today's session. Closed captioning is also available. You can enable captions by adjusting the subtitle settings in the More section on your screen. Before we continue with our program today, I'm just going to briefly outline some session norms for today's institute. Under equity of voice and learning, we have take space, make space. So as a participant, please be mindful of any privileged identities you may hold and help to create an environment for everyone to contribute. Next, we have speak from personal experience. Let's own our statements and views and not presume to be able to speak for others. And under how we show up for ourselves and each other, we have openness to learning. So this is an understanding that we're all learners in this space, and flexibility and patience. Things may not always go 100% according to plan, and sometimes technology is at play. I currently have 2 different computers going right now. So we thank you for your grace and flexibility. And use the chat box mindfully. So when you're using the chat, we ask you to make your questions and comments as relevant to what we're talking about as possible. And then confidentiality. So take away lessons, but not personal content. Participants can and are encouraged to share knowledge, ideas, and resources in these sessions. But if anyone shares anything personal, we ask that you don't bring it out of the space. And I also want to encourage you to take breaks when you need, take care of yourself, and enjoy our session. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Gina to guide us through today's session. Welcome, Gina.
Thank you. It's nice to be here with all of you. Welcome to our session today. I'm just doing a few little last minute things here. All right, so welcome again, and let's get started. So my name is Gina Spears. This is my 27th year of teaching dance in CPS. I've been mentoring early years educators for about 11 years. And I've been providing professional development for about 20 years. And I was on the dance content writing team for the Illinois arts standards, which we'll be talking about today. And this is my motto. My motto is teaching students is my joy and teaching teachers is my passion. So I still find a lot of joy in being in the classroom and working with my students, but I am also very passionate about helping educators. Here's our agenda for today. First, we'll do some introductions, which we've already done, and we'll talk about our objectives for the day. Then we'll talk about how to find the Illinois Arts Learning Standards and some background information on how those were created. We'll talk about how the Illinois Arts Standards are organized. We'll learn how to unpack a standard. Then we'll talk about standards-based instructional practices. And at the end, there'll be time for Q&A and there'll be an exit slip and we can talk about next steps. So our objectives for today. Participants will become familiar with the Illinois Arts Learning Standards. Hopefully when you walk away today, you'll have a better understanding of how to look through the standards and find what you need. You'll practice unpacking a standard, and you will apply the standards to your own instructional practice. So let's talk about those Illinois Arts Learning Standards. Why do we have standards and where do we find them? So fun fact for all of you. I'm going to do one more thing to my view. Give me just a moment. Thank you. Oops. All right, so a fun fact. Illinois was one of the first states to formally adopt the National Core Arts Standards as our state learning standards for the arts, and they were adopted in 2016. So the Illinois Arts Council gathered teams of teachers for each of the different disciplines, and we looked through the standards for our discipline, one standard at a time. We unpacked them and we discussed whether or not we wanted to change them for the students we see in our state, or whether we thought that they would be fine the way they were. In most cases, the national standards were not really edited. Maybe, I know for the dance ones, we changed maybe a couple of words, but we didn't change the standards as they were. And honestly, most of us were using the national standards for 4 or 5 years before Illinois wanted to adopt them. So we were already used to using those standards. So I'd like you to take a moment and drop into the chat for me. What is a learning standard? In your own words, what is a learning standard? A guiding objective, something that measures the growth of a student, good. A map for learning. A tool for accountability, yes. It describes a goal, good. Agreements on how art should be or could be taught. Base foundational knowledge and allows for measurement. Tells what a student should know and be able to do. Clearly defined action against which students' progress can be measured. A container that holds objectives for learning. I like that image. I'll give a couple more moments in case you're still typing. All right, thank you. You are all on track with what a learning standard is. Great job. Okay, so a lot of people ask, why do we have standards-based instruction? Why can't I just say, I want the kids to learn ballet, so I'm just going to walk in the room and teach ballet? Why do we need the standards-based instruction? So standards-based instruction provides clear goals. Some of you said that in the chat just now. It provides accountability. So if everyone across our state is being asked to teach directions on stage directions, right? Then we know that there's accountability there, that everyone's teaching the same thing and all the students are getting what they need. It provides a common language for arts partners and teaching artists. This is great because it provides a common language between you and your teaching artists and between your teaching artists and the teachers in the school buildings that they're working with. It provides you a way to evaluate growth for you and the students. So you can determine whether or not the students have learned what they're supposed to learn and how that impacts your future instruction. And it helps the students evaluate their own growth. It builds on prior knowledge. When we look at the standards today, the standards are organized pre-K all the way through high school. And you can look across the standards and see how it grows from your tiniest students all the way to your most, those students who need the most challenge, right? And you can see how it builds on prior knowledge. And it provides rigor. So having standards really holds the bar for your instruction. So first, I'm going to give you the chance to just look at the National Core Arts Standards. We're not going to do a ton of things with the National Core Arts Standards, but if we have it open, you'll be able to see how the Illinois standards were built off of the National Core Arts Standards. So there's a link there, and we're going to drop it in the chat. There's also a QR code here as well. Go ahead and open the National Core Arts Standards, so you can take a look at that website in case you've never been there. So you'll see at the top of the website, there's a place where you can customize and create your own handbook. So for example, if you're an arts organization who primarily does music, you can customize a handbook here on the National Core Arts Standards website and tell it only to give you the music standards or only to give you the music standards and the ones that fall under responding, right? So you can customize a handbook on this site, which is kind of nice and kind of fun to do. And if you scroll down, you'll see what I have here on the screen are the anchor standards for every single discipline. And I think that's what's really nice about these standards is that there's this overarching thing that all of us do, regardless of what discipline we teach. And then the individual standards for each discipline are there as well. You don't need to bookmark this website because you'll have access to the slides as a handout, and there's a link to it in the resources as well. So next, I'd like you to open the Illinois Arts Learning Standards. And again, we have a link. We have the QR code if that's easier for you. And when you open these standards and you scroll down to the bottom, you have the option of downloading sets of standards for yourself. You can download all of the standards, or if you are a theater organization and you only want to download the theater ones are there, you can download just those. And as you click around on both of those sites, you're going to see that the layout of the standards and how they're organized is almost exactly the same from one site to the next. So the reason I had you do that is just so you can see that these are actually adopted from the national standards. And you pretty much can use either site to get and find what you need. The Illinois site does not let you make the customizable handbook for yourself. but I am going to provide some resources for you that are discipline specific if that's something that you're looking for, something you hope to have. If you have multiple tabs open now on your phone or on your device, I recommend keeping the Illinois Learning Standards open because we're going to use those later, but you can close the national ones if you wish. And again, you'll have links to the national ones in the resources. I'm going to pause for a minute in case you're still clicking around and perusing and looking around at those standards. I'll just give you a couple more moments to do that.
And Gina, I see Dana's got a question. She wants to know, what are EUs and EQs and process?
I'm going to talk about that.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'm going to break down the standards and tell you all the different parts of the standards next. All right, so now let's talk about how the standards are organized. So there are multiple parts to the standards. And as we noted earlier, I'm in charge of teaching the teachers in my building how to use arts integration in their classrooms. And for anyone, even the arts teachers, you open up the standards and there's like so much information there and it can be really overwhelming to look through. So I'm going to break down for you the different parts of the standards and how they're organized so that you understand what all this is about. Okay, so there are artistic processes and anchor standards. There are essential questions, which is the EQs, and there are enduring understanding, which is the EUs. And then there are standards for each discipline from pre-K through 12. Now let's talk about what all that means. So first, let's talk about artistic processes. So in the National Core Arts Standards, they define artistic processes as the cognitive and physical actions by which arts learning and making are realized. Now that's very, very heavy, very deep, right? So let's talk about the artistic processes and what they are. And I'd like you to note that the artistic processes are the same for any discipline, regardless of what your specialty is. Okay, so they're the same for visual art as they are for music, dance, theater, and media arts. And they are for all of the grades. So this image comes from the National Core Arts Standards. The artistic processes are creating, performing, responding, and connecting. And on this slide, I have the National Core Arts Standards definition of each of those, but I'm going to break that down a little further for you. So creating is the making of the art. So the students conceive, they develop, they revise, and they refine their artwork as an artist, a director, a choreographer, a composer, and so on. Performing, which can also be known as presenting or producing, is the sharing of the artwork, or sometimes it is the doing of the artwork, such as performing. So the students present as a dancer, an actor, an artist, a musician, and so on. Responding is evaluating and understanding how the arts convey meaning. So you're looking at a work of art and you're thinking about it and you're responding to it. So students respond as an audience member, a critic, and so on. And also when they self or peer critique, they're also responding to the artwork. And finally, the last artistic process is connecting. So connecting is relating those artistic ideas to personal experiences and other contexts such as society, history, and culture. And the connecting standards are a little deeper than arts integration connections. So when you're using the connecting standards specifically in an art form, it's a little deeper than making a connection between dance and a storybook. It's a little deeper than that. And a lot of people always ask me, I mentor new teachers a lot, and sometimes they're not real familiar with the standards. And they often ask me, what's the difference between the responding standards and the connecting standards? How do I differentiate between the two? So I like to think of responding as external. So it's a reflection on an external set of information. It's generally focused through comparing works of art and critical analysis. Connecting, on the other hand, is an internal process. So in connecting, the students are synthesizing multiple sources of knowledge in order to develop multiple entry points for personal expression. And that was a lot of information, so I'm gonna pause and let you take it all in for a moment. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the anchor standards. The National Core Arts Standards defines anchor standards as anchor standards describe the general knowledge and skill that teachers expect students to demonstrate throughout their education in the arts. So now let's break that down and talk about what that means. So again, just like the artistic processes, the anchor standards are the same for every arts discipline, and they're the same for every single grade. These are the anchor standards that fall under the artistic process of creating. So we have generate and conceptualize artistic ideas and work. So that's brainstorming and coming up with what you're going to make or create. Organize and develop artistic ideas and work. So now you're working on that artistic creation. And then revise, refine, and complete the artistic work. And I just have a reminder on every slide here, the anchor standards are the same for every arts discipline. So the anchor standards are like an umbrella over which the other standards fall. The anchor standards for performing or presenting and producing are select, analyze, and interpret artistic work for presentation, develop and refine artistic techniques and work for presentation, and convey meaning through the presentation of artistic work. So this can be through performing a dance or performing a play, but it can also be through presenting a sculpture or a painting. The anchor standards for responding are perceive and analyze artistic work, construct meaningful interpretations of artistic work, and apply criteria to evaluate artistic work. And I'm just going to point out for responding number 9, if you have your students create artistic work and then you have them peer assess or self-assess, or you're creating an artistic work on the students, like I'm choreographing a dance and I'm teaching it to the students, right? That criteria to evaluate might fall into my assessment tool for evaluating that work. And then under artistic process for connecting, our anchor standards are synthesize and relate knowledge and personal experiences to make art, and relate artistic ideas and works with societal, cultural, and historical context to deepen understanding. Again, these anchor standards are the same for every arts discipline. So these are not the individual standards for dance or drama or music or visual art or media arts. These are the umbrella standards that go over top of all of those standards. And then there are other sections to the standards. Those EQs, the essential questions, those are overarching questions to kind of guide your instruction. And again, the EQs are the same for every single discipline. And if you decide to use those in your instruction, I recommend putting them in student-friendly language and connecting it more closely to the discipline you're teaching. The EUs are enduring understandings, and those are big ideas, transferable big ideas and takeaways. So what are those like major things that you want the students to take away from that unit of instruction, where they come back to you 3 years later and they're like, oh my gosh, I remember when we did this, this, and this, and this is what I learned, right? At the end of the standards, whether you're looking at the national or the Illinois, there's a glossary at the end of the standards for each of the different disciplines. So that's just vocabulary that's defined for you. And then on the national standards, you can also find what are known as benchmark assessments. So when they created the national standards, they decided that they should create benchmarks at certain grade levels. And they created sample assessments that might happen at those particular grade levels, with the thought that, like, if a student is studying music in a school and they have music in pre-K and in kindergarten and in first grade, then when they're in second grade, they should be able to know and be able to complete a certain type of benchmark that builds on everything they've learned in those years prior. So if you're curious about that, again, that's only in the national standards, but if you're curious about it, you can check it out. I'll be honest, I don't use those benchmark assessments. I create my own. All right, I just gave you a lot of information. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to just like take a break, take a breather, take a moment, think about what was just said and how I broke down how the standards are organized. And when we come back, we'll talk about how to look at those individual standards for your disciplines. My music is exactly 3 minutes. So when you hear the music turn off, you'll know that the break time is over. All right. Before we move on and look at actual individual standards by grade level and discipline, I'm going to take a moment and just allow a little bit of Q&A in case there's anything that popped in your head during the break that you would like to ask instead of waiting until the end of the presentation. And in the meantime, make sure you do have the Illinois Arts Learning Standards open and scroll down and choose which discipline you would like to look at. So depending on your organization or your specialty, if you want to look at music or theater, whatever it is you want to look at, go ahead and have that open so you'll have that in a little while. Do we have any questions?
Hi.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm Ollie from The Simple Good, and I appreciate you highlighting the difference between response and connections, but do you think that you could just give like a hypothetical example between both? So much of what we do is about students connecting through their artwork, right? But it would be really great to hear just like a hypothetical example to help me understand a little bit better.
Sure. So when we look at the individual standards for each discipline, you'll be able to like see like what they're asking the students to do in responding and what they're asking the students to do in connecting. And it'll hopefully narrow it down for you a little bit better. Responding, I'm going to come at it from a dance teacher point of view because that's what I do. So responding would be students looking at the beginning section of Alvin Ailey's Revelations, and they watch the first 2 minutes of the dance. I turn the video off, and I ask them to turn and talk. What did you see? What did you notice? What are you wondering? Connecting would be they watch that same video, but I'm asking them to listen to the lyrics of the song and make connections between the lyrics of the song and what they know about the civil rights movement.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to move on. All right, so now we're going to learn what's called unpacking a standard. And this is something that teachers do regardless of what the standards are. So if I'm a math teacher, I have to unpack the math standard. Earlier, when I asked you to write in the chat what a standard is, someone said that a standard is what the students should know and be able to do. So when you unpack a standard, that's what you're looking for. What should the students know and what should the students be able to do? Now, I'm not talking about those anchor standards that we just looked at. I'm talking about the actual standards. So if I'm teaching dance to fourth graders, I am looking at the fourth grade standards for dance, and I'm unpacking them to figure out what should the students know and what should they be able to do. And the easiest way to do this is to think about it as in nouns and verbs. So when you unpack the standards for the essential knowledge, you're asking yourself, what do the students need to know? And you're looking for the nouns. So what I have here in front of you is a first grade dance standard. That first grade dance standard reads, move safely in general space through a range of activities and group formations while maintaining personal space. Now, I would not stand in front of a group of first graders and read that out loud and expect them to just know exactly what I'm talking about and do it, right? So I have to unpack it and figure it out for myself and then develop my instruction around that. Now, before we think about what those nouns are, let's look at how the standards are organized. So the DA there stands for dance. PR is the performing standard, right? So remember we were talking about the artistic processes, right? The artistic process is performing. 5 is anchor standard number 5. And then it's the first standard. And then under it, that second one is for first grade. And then for first grade, there's a first grade A, and here it's first grade B. So there's more than one standard that falls under performing anchor standard 5 in dance. So when you're looking at those codes in the chart there, that's kind of how it's organized. All right, so now let's look for the nouns. Before I show you the nouns, I'm going to give you a moment to look at them. Just read through that standard and think to yourself, what are the nouns? What do the students need to know? So I've highlighted for you the nouns, right? The students need to know general space. They need to know activities. You can say range of activities if you wish. They need to know group formations, and they need to know personal space. So now I know what I'm looking for, what I need to teach them. I need to teach them what general space is. I need to teach them what personal space is. I need to teach them how to make group formations through a range of activities. Next, we think about essential skills. So what do the students need to be able to do? The to do is your verbs. So you're looking for the verbs. On the left, I have that same exact standard that we looked at a moment ago. Take a moment and find the verbs in that standard. So now I've got my highlight in yellow, which were the nouns, what they need to know. And now I've highlighted in blue what the verbs are, what they need to be able to do. And you'll notice I've included phrases and not just the verbs, right? So I need the key thing for me, these are first graders, right? The key thing for me is not that they move, but that they move safely, right? And then they need to be able to maintain that personal space when they're moving safely. Once you know what the students need to know and what they need to be able to do, you're ready to plan your instruction. I'm going to move back a slide. So once I've broken down that first grade standard, I know the students need to know personal space and general space. They need to be able to differentiate between the two, right? They need to be able to make group formations, standing in a square, standing in a circle, standing in 4 lines. And they need to be able to move safely. And they need to be able to maintain personal space while moving safely. And I need to teach this to them through a variety of activities. I'm not going to be able to teach this standard in one lesson, probably. I'm probably going to teach elements of this standard throughout a variety of lessons so that they can really master it and really get good at it. I'm going to pause again in case there are questions. About unpacking. So to do a little recap, when you look at the standards, you have your artistic processes, your create, perform, respond, connect. Then you have your anchor standards, the big overarching standards for all of the disciplines. And then under that, you have your first grade standards, second grade standards, third grade standards for your discipline, whatever that is. Can we do a quick, do we have React at the bottom of the screen? Can we do a quick React that we're ready to move forward and try unpacking a standard? You can just do a thumbs up if you feel like you got it and you're ready to try. If you'd like to unmute or drop a question into the chat, please feel free. Katrina, that's a great question. I'm going to break down what you said. Number one, I don't touch on a standard, I teach the standard. So I usually plan on teaching explicitly one standard per lesson. If a standard is really bulky, and I will say, you know, when the kids are little, it's like, make a dance with a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? But then when they get older, it's like, make a dance with a beginning, a middle, and an end that has a personal, that describes a personal experience, and then talk about it. You know, like it becomes really, really challenging as they get older, and it may take me longer to teach the standard. But I teach one standard per lesson, and I might scaffold in other standards that either need to be repeated and refreshed or that take a little longer to master. So for example, that first grade standard we were looking at, it takes first graders a really long time to be able to move around the dance space while maintaining personal space. So I might explicitly teach that in a lesson, but I'm going to talk about it in multiple lessons until they really get the hang of it. So I might be teaching a standard on locomotor and non-locomotor movement, and I'm refreshing their memories about how to use the locomotor movement while maintaining personal space, if that makes sense. But I don't do multiple standards in a lesson. I don't try to teach multiple standards in a lesson. No, you don't use the exact wording of the standard in your lesson, Adam. You will be, we'll talk about this in a moment. You take the standards and you write your learning objectives, and then you write them in student-friendly language. But yes, I do specifically use the words general space and personal space because I want my first graders to learn that vocabulary. Plus, they're learning personal space and general space and physical education. So we want to make sure that the language is the same from one discipline to the next. Tyra, I have a question for you. You said, would you say the artistic processes are interchangeable in how they're introduced? What do you mean by interchangeable? Feel free to unmute.
Hi. I might have misunderstood, but I think when you were defining the or listing the artistic processes, you said create, respond, perform, connect. So I was just wondering that when approaching curriculum, do you have a preference in the order that you address those standards? Like, do you scaffold it? Is it a buildup, or do you feel like it doesn't necessarily um, matter the order in which those processes are introduced?
Yeah, so the processes and the anchor standards are not organized in the order that you should teach them.
Right.
When I develop curriculum, I'm a backwards planner. So when I develop my curriculum, I create a thematic unit, but I plan with the end in mind. So, for example, my third grade unit is on student identity, and my end product, my summative assessment, if you will, is the students create their own choreography that expresses parts of their identity. And so I know that my end result is that choreography project. And then I plan backwards from there on how I'm going to get them to that point. And there may be days where I'm really focusing on a create standard, and there may be days where they practice performing their dances in front of each other, and so I'm focusing on a performing standard. I might show them a video of a dance that tells a story about a personal experience, and that's a responding standard. But then I might show a video on another day and ask them to connect that back to theirs, or do a dance history lesson, and that's a connecting standard. So I figure out the order of the instruction based on what's going to be the best flow to get my students to that end result. Does that help?
It does. Thank you.
Okay. Yep, absolutely. And then for Juliet, when you're planning individual lesson plans, best practice is to start with the standard. And I'll talk about that in a little while. But yes, when you're figuring out that 1 hour lesson that you're going to teach to your third graders, right? I start with the standard, and then I create my lesson around that standard. And again, I'm going to talk in more detail about what that looks like. These are great questions. Okay, so Benjamin Franklin said, "Tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn." So now it's time for you all to do a little work to see if you understand what this unpacking standards is like. Okay, so I know it's a lot of information to process, which is why I paused several times just to make sure I'm not going too fast, right? I'd like you to choose a standard and try unpacking it. So open the Illinois Learning Standards for the discipline that is your forte or that is what you teach, and choose any grade level you want, any artistic process you want. Choose an individual standard, like that individual first grade standard that I shared with you. Okay. And I've got 2 documents here that I've adapted from the CPS Department of Arts that will help you think through that. What are the nouns? What are the verbs part of this activity? On the left-hand side, on the gray side of the screen, there's a QR code. It is a completed template using a theater example, breaking down a theater. Right? That standard I chose for first grade was the move in general space, right? You're going to type that into that box at the top, and then you're going to walk through the template. What are the nouns? What are the verbs? Okay. And we're dropping into the chat links to both of those, so you have those as well. And I'm going to give you some work time. And when we're done with the work time, we'll see if you have any questions or if anybody wants to share what they unpacked and make sure they're doing it right, you know, whatever works for you at that point. But for right now, pick a standard and try unpacking it. All right, friends, how are we doing? Are we ready to talk about unpacking standards now that you've had a chance to try it? If you find this work to be challenging, give yourself some grace. Unpacking standards takes time to just sit down and undo the unpacking. And the thought process of unpacking also takes time. I will say when I am working with early years educators and mentoring them, I really encourage them to do this every time they teach a lesson. But me, now that I know the standards pretty well and I'm pretty well versed in the standards, I can look at the standard and immediately know what do the students need to know, what do the students need to be able to do, and go and start planning my lesson. I don't go through this process step by step anymore because I've already trained my brain to do that nouns and verbs work in my head. Are there any questions? Is there anyone who's not quite sure if they did it right and they want to ask questions or share? Okay. All right, so now let's talk about how to use the standards in your instructional practice. So how do teachers use the standards to develop their instruction? And some of you were kind of asking about that along the way, right? So I've unpacked the standard. I know what the students need to know. I know what the students are supposed to be able to do. What do I do with that information and how does that turn into a lesson plan? So best practice for teachers is this, right? The first thing they do is they unpack the standard. The second thing they do, and this is actually at the bottom of your template, is they develop the learning objectives. So for that first grade standard, right, my learning objectives may be, my first learning objective could be students need to be able to move through general space. My second learning objective might be students need to be able to maintain personal space while moving through general space. And then my third learning objective for that standard will have something to do with those group formations. Students will be able to make group formations. And maybe I want to be more specific than that. Maybe I want the students to be able to stand in 4 lines and stand in a circle, right? Because that's important to wherever I'm going with my unit. But I take what I learned about the standard and I develop learning objectives for that standard. As students get older, there'll be more learning objectives because as you break down the standard, there's multiple things that they're going to need to be able to know and be able to do. Once I make my learning objectives, I will then take those learning objectives and write them in student-friendly language. We had that question in the chat, right? So if my learning objective says students will be able to move safely through general space, right? My student-friendly language might be, I can move safely through general space, right? And I would say when you're planning these lessons, especially if you're an arts organization or a teaching artist and you're co-planning with the teachers inside of the school, right? Ask them what that student-friendly language should look like. A lot of schools are being asked to write a learning target And some schools are being asked to write the I can statements. So it's good to just have that conversation so that when you're putting it up on the board and telling the students this is what we're doing today, that you're putting it in the language the students are used to seeing. Once you create your learning objectives, then the next thing teachers do is they create what are called tasks. Tasks are the activities that take place during your lesson that are helping students meet the learning objectives and master the standard. So when I create a lesson plan, when I plan a lesson plan, I do these 3 things for every lesson that I do, right? What's the standard? What are my learning objectives? And then what are my activities? They're going to help them learn those things. And it's a continuous cycle because it happens for every lesson. And then we're quite often asked, right? How do we know if the students have learned it? That's your assessment piece. I'm not going to go into great detail on assessment, although assessment is one of my specialties. I do have time to answer questions about it, but you create that lesson plan and you have some kind of assessment at the end of the lesson that lets you know if the students have learned it, right? I can do an observational assessment of that first grade lesson. Maybe we do freeze dance at the end of class, right? And as students are moving around the room during freeze dance, I'm looking and monitoring whether or not they can move safely through general space. Can they maintain personal space while passing by their classmates during that freeze dance, right? And I can keep track of, I've got 4 kids that are like literally crashing into other people, right? Then I can make a notation on my grade book that those 4 students haven't mastered the standard yet. I'm going to pause again for questions again. You can write your questions in the chat or you can unmute if you wish. That's fine too.
I have a quick question, Gina.
Sure.
It's something that I was wondering because I was recently giving my 12-year-old her first piano lessons, and she has not had any music instruction like in her whole life. So I'm wondering what kinds of things you might do if, let's say, you were going to walk into a classroom or work with a teacher that's got a brand that just started at a school, and they have a class of 7th graders who hasn't had dance instruction before. So when you're looking at a 7th grade, dance standard, it might have a whole lot of things that they haven't learned because they haven't mastered the 6th grade standards and the 5th grade and the 4th grade. So what are some of the things that you do to, first of all, figure out if students are sort of at grade level, right? But also what you do to like how you navigate that?
Okay, that's a great question. And that happens quite a bit, especially in dance, because so few schools have dance, right? So a lot of times a principal will hire an arts partner and the arts partner comes in and they're working with 5th graders and those 5th graders have never had dance before, right? First, best practice is always focus on the standard for the grade level that you have in front of you, right? So if I'm walking into a building and I'm only working with the 5th graders, I'm working with all 3 homerooms of 5th graders, right? I'm teaching them dance, but I know they've never had dance before, unless they're taking dance outside of school, but that's neither here nor there. I'm looking at the 5th grade standards when I'm planning my instruction, but what's nice about those charts, I talked a bit at the beginning about how cumbersome they are, right? But what's nice about those tables is I can look at the 5th grade standard, and the 5th grade standard clearly says this is what the students need to know and be able to do. And then I can follow that row all the way back to like kindergarten and first grade and see like what kinds of things should they have been doing in kindergarten and first grade that leads me to the 5th grade standard. And that might give me my ideas for what kinds of activities I can put in my instruction to lead them towards the 5th grade standard. They might not master the 5th grade standard if dance is brand new, but at least I can look on that table and see what's the trajectory of that standard, right? Like I was saying, that standard for first grade says improvise the dance with a beginning, middle, and end. But the 8th grade standard is way more than that. It's like they're like choreographing a dance and it has a beginning and a middle and an end, and it has all these other things in it, right? But I know that back when they were little, they should have been starting out by just improvising it. So I might have an improvisational component to that lesson plan that I know scaffolds and leads them into the grade level standard. I would also say on the assessment piece, right? It's really great, especially if you're walking into a building where the students, you know what, even if they do have that particular discipline in their building, it's always good to do a diagnostic assessment, which is a pre-assessment to just see where the students are at. So you may sit down and co-plan with the 4th grade homeroom teachers, this arts integrated project you're going to do with the kids, right? And you might be a theater teacher and they might have a drama teacher in the building, right? But you might want to do a diagnostic assessment just to see, like, here's where the kids are going to end up. They're going to write their own plays on a personal experience. They're going to divide into groups and create these skits. They're going to make their own props. They're going to perform it in front of an audience. This is where we're going with this, right? On the first day, I might do an improvisational activity that's a formative, a diagnostic assessment, just to see where the kids are at, right? So I know how much I need to front load during that lesson to give them the skills they need to get to where we're planning for them to go. Is that helpful? I kind of talked about it from 2 angles.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Gina, I also had a question about, like, if you are an arts partner stepping into a classroom where a teacher might already have, like, we're a theater that partners with theater teachers a lot. So where they might already have assessments that they do for specific units for students. Do you have any experience with like how you've kind of seen arts partners like adapt to or use classroom teachers' assessments, or whether like us layering on our own assessments is kind of like overkill because the students are being assessed also by their teachers? Or how do you approach that sort of collaboration?
Yeah, I think that's where your co-planning has to start. Like when you're doing your co-planning with that theater teacher that you're going to be working with, right? There needs to be really clear communication. Like, okay, you're coming into my classroom and here's where I am. Here's where I'm at. Here's what the kids already know when you walk into my classroom. Like that theater teacher should be telling you that's where the kids are at, right? And if there's already an assessment in place, can they share that assessment with you? And if there's things that you need to assess, can they be blended into the assessment that's already there? So it's not multiple assessments, right? Because you might need certain data to come out of those assessments, right? To bring back to your organization, because maybe you need to share that data with your funders, right? That theater teacher doesn't need all that. That theater teacher needs the assessment data to provide grades for the kids. But you might be able to communicate and blend those assessments together if necessary, instead of doing too many. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I cannot see all of your pictures, but I see that Lynn has a hand raised, so I'll call on Lynn and we'll look for other hand raises.
Thanks, Gina.
Sure.
I have a sort of part 1, part 2 question. So the part 1 is, most of us are not, don't have the luxury of being in a school for an entire school year, building progressive skills. But if you do, like yourself and other arts teachers, I'm curious, is your goal to go through an entire set of standards throughout the year, like to hit each one of the standards, or to focus on hitting all the anchor standards and as many of the enduring understandings underneath those anchor standards? I'm just curious how you approach a year's worth of planning.
Yes, so the goal is that, and you know, it's a lot of standards, and a lot of those standards take multiple lessons in which to teach. I kind of alluded to that, especially those standards for, I teach pre-K through 8, the 6, 7, 8 standards, like I could spend 5 lessons just teaching one standard because it's so, there's so much information. The goal when these standards were created, the national standards, when these national standards were created, the thought process was, and it's kind of that that Ingenuity motto, right? All kids, all schools, all disciplines, everybody has it, right? So when they made the national standards, they created these standards in the hopes that every school would have a certified teacher in every discipline teaching all of these standards, and they see the students all year long. Now, I only see my students by the semester. So I see them from September to January, and then I see a whole new group of kids from January to June. So I don't have that much, I don't have the luxury of time to teach every single standard every single year. But that was the intent. The intent was that you would teach every single standard across a school year to all the grade levels that you teach. For me, I do my best to hit as many standards as I can during a school year. And I teach 2 units per grade level per school year. But I prioritize what those standards are. And I try to make sure when I'm thinking across my scope and sequence, because I do teach pre-K through 8th grade, that I prioritize my standards for my 2nd grade unit, and I know what my 12 priority standards are, that those are the ones that I really want the kids to know by the end of the school year. And I might dip into the other standards and throw them in there, but I'm not assessing them. They're not as important to me at that moment. But I make sure when they get to 3rd grade that whatever I skipped over or just kind of glazed over in the standards, that I make sure my 3rd graders learn that standard. Right? Because again, they build on each other. So I know if in 2nd grade I didn't get to respond 9 as well as I wanted to, then in 3rd grade I need to make sure my 3rd grade unit really hones in on respond 9, right? So that they're not missing that content.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And thank you. I was curious about interpretation of the standards from that perspective. But that leads me to part B, which is that in most cases, many of us on this call are going to be doing short-term residencies or even a short-term workshop series. And I guess I'm going to assume that your answer is that the way to identify the standards that are being addressed is to have conversation with your teacher, because I wonder how you might suggest prioritizing which standards we should be addressing coming in on short-term workshops or residencies.
Yes. And I know from working with arts organizations, like that co-planning part is so important. And sometimes there's time for it and sometimes there's not, right? But that's an important part of the co-planning process, is figuring out, like, you know, you sit down with the teacher, and a lot of times it's arts integration, right? So you're sitting down with the teacher, I'm talking to the 7th grade English language arts teacher, I'm the dance teacher, and the timing of when I'm going to be in the building is when they're doing their poetry unit. So the teacher wants the kids to understand this, and this about writing and understanding poems, right? But they want me to come in and create something where they interpret their poems through movement, right? So then I'm going to look at the standards and I'm going to say, okay, so they're interpreting. So I need to look through the standards for 7th grade and figure out which of those standards is about interpreting. They're making their own dances. So I need to look through the 7th grade dance standards and figure out which of those standards which of the create standards pair well with what I'm going to be doing with the students. Does that make sense? And then figuring out how to build the unit off of that. You're not going to get, if I'm only in there for 6 weeks and there's going to be a show at the end of the 6 weeks, right? Which I'm going to need that rehearsal time and stuff, then I have to figure out like what standards am I really going to teach here? And then I need to really explicitly teach those standards, because if this building doesn't have dance, right?
Yeah.
I at least want those kids to walk away with that create standard, maybe a perform standard, and maybe a connect standard, because they're doing the interpretation, right? So I might have 3 main standards that I'm teaching.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Thank you, Gina.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I see, a question
thank
from
you.
Tyra in there.
Okay.
Tyra's asking, is the structure of the standards template something non-arts teachers would be familiar with?
The structure of the way the standards are organized, is that what you're asking, Tyra?
I'm more so wondering about the way that you approach creating your curriculum, like that 3-step approach that you spoke about. I was wondering, is that something that other teachers that focus on different subjects are also familiar with? Although I know this is specific to the arts, but even for, non-humanities teachers, I was just wondering if that formula is something that they practice as well.
And you mean, I just want to make sure I'm understanding right. You mean like unpacking the standard, coming up with the
Yes.
objectives, and then yes, that's best practice for all teachers. All
Okay.
teachers should be doing that. But I will tell you though, if I don't know how many of you have heard about Skyline. Skyline is an online curriculum that a lot of schools are using. If they're using Skyline, a lot of that work has already been done for them. So Skyline is online curriculum that was created by teachers for teachers to use in their classroom. So there's like a Skyline social studies, there's a Skyline science, there's a Skyline ELA, there's a Skyline math. So if I'm a social studies teacher and I'm being instructed by my principal to use Skyline, I don't have to break down the standard and write the learning objective or come up with my activities, because Skyline already did it for me. It's already there. But they should know how to do that. That's best practice for developing any kind of lesson.
Thank you.
Yes. And I see there's a hand up with Juliet.
Hi, yeah, I wanted to ask how much, Gina, you find yourself needing to layer in like social emotional learning standards along with arts curriculum, and sort of how you approach that, because I think that comes up a lot in pre-planning with teachers as things that they are also hoping to get out of an arts residency.
Yes, I use SEL at the beginning and end of every lesson that I teach. And there are SEL learning standards for the state of Illinois. You can find them on ISBE's website, but I will also share it. So after the fact, when you get your resources after this workshop, we'll add that in so that it's there. So yes, I do an awful lot of SEL with my students, and I tap into those standards all the time. But I think that, yes, but I think that the arts and SEL go hand in hand. They're interwoven, they're interlinked, if you think about it. Like my students can't My students can't move in my dance classroom unless they know how to respect the boundaries of other students in the room. My students can't move and learn a dance and dance in unison unless they develop teamwork skills along the way. Do you know what I mean? Like SEL and the arts are very, very, very well linked. Are there other hands raised that I can't see? I've got my view, so I only see a couple of people.
I have one more question.
Sure.
So for a lot of organizations that focus on theater, we create educational packets, which, you know, we also call study guides. And a lot of the time we include different activities in the packets for teachers to try out in their classrooms or adapt to their liking. And I was just wondering, based on what you just shared, do you think it is helpful for us to identify um, standards to accompany those lesson plans, or do you think that it may be doing them a disservice and allowing the teachers to uh, observe the lesson plan and then select what standard they would like to focus on as a result of that?
Do you mean when you're working with a classroom teacher or when you're working with another?
So that's the thing. With study guide packets, we usually use it to contextualize whatever the work of art is that we're exploring, but we don't do it in collaboration with the teachers. It's a
Okay.
resource we are providing to their benefit and to unpack in the classroom with their students. But because we don't exactly know what are the standards they're trying to hone in on for that school year or that unit, it's not something that we can, I guess, make evergreen and appeal to every single person who may be accessing that activity or that resource packet.
Yeah, so I would say if you can connect it to a standard, I would do it. And I say that because if you're producing that study guide and it's going to a classroom teacher, my experience is that classroom teachers are not well-versed in the arts standards. Like I said earlier, I organize the professional development for the staff at my building on arts integration techniques. And most of the teachers in my building had no idea that there are individual standards for grade level for dance. Most of those teachers were only putting the anchor standard in their lesson plan, that overarching standard. And so, and then when they saw like, oh my gosh, I'm a kindergarten teacher and now there's 15 standards for dance and 15 standards for theater and, like, there was just like this, like, mind blown, but also this overwhelming feeling like there's so many. I would say if you have the opportunity to connect a standard to it, I would put it in there so that it's already there and it's already visible to whoever it is that's looking at it. And if you would ever, if any of you would ever need help, like figuring that, like, well, okay, so here's what I've got. We already have this produced. How do I figure out which standard aligns to these things? I'd be happy to, like, I don't know, consult on that and help you find where those connections lie. But yeah, I'd put it in there so that it's there.
Thank you.
So I have my resources page pulled up here. And these are all links for you, but I wanted to point out a couple of them just so you know what it is that you're looking at. So there's a link to the National Core Art Standards website and the link to the Illinois Learning Standards website. Those are the websites we went to at the beginning of the session. There's a one-pager that the National Core Art Standards published that is the anchor standards and the artistic processes all on one page, if that's something that is interesting to you. The template we used to unpack the standards when you had a chance to practice finding the nouns and the verbs, the force copy link is there, as well as the example with the theater standard. And then the slides that I had at the beginning where we talked about what are these artistic processes and how do we understand what they are, that those came from slide decks that I made for the teachers in my building. A slide deck on what are the artistic processes and a slide deck on the anchor standards. So those two links that begin with the word understanding are like just that, in case there's an interest in sharing that with others that are in your organization. And then down on the right-hand side, something I made for the teachers in my building is I made for them a document with just the dance standards in it, and they're organized by grade level. And so what that did for my teachers is if I'm a kindergarten teacher, I can open up the dance standards, just print the kindergarten pages and put them in a binder or whatever. When I'm integrating movement into my classroom, I don't have to go to that big chart with all those extra things on it. I don't have to look at the EUs and the EQs and look at the, like, scroll down the kindergarten to find what I'm looking for. I can just print my kindergarten dance standards, and then that's what I look at when I'm integrating movement. I can just look and figure out what standards I'm connecting to in my classroom. I apologize for those of you that work with high schoolers, but because my building is pre-K through 8, these documents that I'm sharing with you are just pre-K through 8. But like we were talking, like some of you are only a theater organization, you can print out that theater standards in one document, and that has your pre-K through 8, just the theater standards. You don't have to scroll through anything extra. So I just wanted to let you know that those links are there. And my email is there. I am a resource to you as well. And I'm just going to keep allowing for questions if there's any other questions you all may have. Check the chat real quick.
So I'd love to take this opportunity just to piggyback a little bit off of Tyra's question and some of Lynn's comments that I think go along with that question. One thing that you might be able to do in our community of practice next week would be to bring a study guide or something that you already have that's part of your curriculum and get into a working group to say, okay, let's figure out what standards these are aligned to that we can add to the study guide to help teachers understand what standards they might be addressing with this, right? So those are some of the things that we may possibly be able to do in our COP next week, that where we have 3 hours to work with each other. And there's other opportunities that we can take advantage of being in a room with each other, really just having that like working group time. So I just wanted to point that out to you all so everyone knows that we have some more opportunity to work with this content.
And I would say also, if you're, it's very tempting to create whatever it is you want to do with your students and then go back at the end and be like, okay, what standard is this? But if you go back and do it at the end, you're not explicitly teaching the standard, and you may be missing out on key components of the standard. So I'd say if you've already got your units that you teach and you know they work really well, I go into the school every year and I always do this, right? Or I have these study guides and the teachers love these study guides and we always use them. I would say when you make those connections to the standards in the units or the study guides, take a moment to unpack the standard and then make sure it really does connect to what you're doing. And maybe there's an opportunity there to tweak the lesson plan and make it a little stronger, because now you know that the students need to know this, and this at the end of that standard, right? And that might be, I guess, an opportunity for growth in using the standards. You know, it'll I guess fine tune what it is that you might already have in place. And I see a question here, should we be able to click on those links? We shared the slide deck and handout form. If you're looking at that and clicking on it, let me know if that doesn't work, and I'll share the slides in another way.
I just put into the chat the in case you didn't get it at the beginning, the link to the slide deck and handout form. So yes, there we go. So you should be able to click on those. And I'm also gonna check that myself too.
I'll also circle back. We were also talking about prioritizing your standards. During COVID, when we were creating the scope and sequence documents for Skyline and the arts, we went through the standards and prioritized them, knowing that during COVID, we weren't going to be able to hit all the standards. What were the key things that we as teachers thought students should know and be able to do in every grade level? I'll share that with you as well when I share the SEL standards for the state of Illinois. It's basically just a chart, and it tells you what the priority standards are for each discipline at each grade level. In case that's helpful, just to know that like these are the priority standards. Oh, good. I'm glad the links work. I thought we would be rushing all the way to the end, so it's nice to have time for people to process and continue to ask questions.
I love this. It sounds like lots of folks have really appreciated everything that you all have done. And so Gina, this has been really, really great. And so before we get folks jumping off here, I just want to share a couple of additional things for you all, just to make sure that we all know what's coming up. So you may have noticed that I just plugged for you all our community of practice, which is in partnership with Arts Ed Shy. And I know there are a number of Arts Ed Shy folks on the call today. So thank you all for all of your help. And that's going to be facilitated by Julia Hart at Timeline Theater. It's in person next week, next Thursday from 2 to 5. There will be food. And there will also be an opportunity for us to really, yes, that should say Juliet. I'm sorry, Juliet. So that will really be an opportunity for us to like get together and work out some of the things that we'd like to do and really spend some time unpacking more things. You'll also have had an opportunity to maybe think about how you might use some of these standards, how you might communicate with some of your teacher, your cooperating teachers, and work on these things together. So you can register using that QR code that's right there, or also you can go to ingenuity-pl.info/2425 COP1. I know that was a lot. I can also, you'll be getting a follow-up email with all these things in there too. But I also wanted to note that we do have TA honoraria available for that as well. So if you're a TA, and we still have, I think, 1 or 2 spots available, or you have some TAs that you would like to make sure that they are there to really work on some of their own lesson planning, then make sure they apply for those. It's $150 for that 3-hour session. So I think it would be a really great use of some folks' time. And I've got the application there for that as well. And then finally, I want to make sure that we can thank Gina very much and thank all of you for all of your wonderful questions, and to continue the conversation next week, but also to let us know how this session was for you, and if you have any feedback for us and how we're operating for Gina specifically. So I'm popping that into the chat as well, to make sure that you all take our exit survey. And you know how I love exit surveys. So this will really help us to make sure that we're getting you all the content that is most relevant for you. Alrighty. Thank you all very much. Thank you so much, Gina. This has been absolutely wonderful. I understand so much more about standards now. So thank you all for being here and for being such a great group to work with.